Thank you, Rajiv, and a very, very good afternoon. Let me say I'm particularly pleased to be at this venue because I have long felt that it was about time that we began to build some nice big venues in South Mumbai that had not been inherited from the British. And so finally, we have one. And of course, this is part of the revamp that this city has been going through in recent years, where the coastal road, the metro system, which is almost now, it's coming on stream step by step. The new airport, which I believe is weeks away. You already have the Atul Setu, etc. So you're living in one of those times of great change in this city and in this country. But it is important here to remember that this sort of change that you're seeing, this era of change that you are seeing, is not something that should be considered as the natural scheme of things. It is based on a particular culture, a way of thinking that has to be built upon and consciously inculcated. And I'm really going to talk here today about how to think about a culture of risk-taking, to look after it and build it. Why I need to say this is because I have also seen it being destroyed. Both Rajiv and I come from a city called Kolkata. When I was born in 1970, it was still India's largest city. It was the single largest commercial hub in the country. And outside of Japan, it was the single largest industrial hub in Asia. And by the time I became an adult, it became effectively a trade union-ridden backwater. So Kolkata really did not die. It was murdered. I am a witness to that murder. So do not think that these times that you are seeing, which are really the beginning, the early shoots that you're seeing of a revival, a renaissance of India as a country, as a civilizational nation that you're witnessing, do not for a second think that this cannot go backwards. So first of all, what we need to do is to appreciate what on earth I'm talking about as a risk-taking culture. Now, sometimes it's easier to think of some other culture because we are very often too close to our own. So therefore, let me talk about the rise of the West, specifically of Europe, about 500 odd years ago. And while we are witnessing the other end of that cycle, of the decline of Europe, it is interesting to go back and look at what led to its renaissance. So, of course, the world has many great hubs of civilization. India is one, China is another. But of course, Europe is another one of those great hubs of human civilization. And the Greco-Roman civilization, the classical European civilization, created many amazing things. The Greeks, and later on the Roman Empire, took classical civilization to great heights in science, in literature, and art, and design. So much so that modern Europe, even today, functions on languages that are based on Latin and Greek. They derive a lot of their architectural and aesthetic sense from that ancient period. So the question then arises, what happened to them and why did they go through the Renaissance? So it's very interesting that from about 5th century BC onwards, Europe went into an upward cycle. Until about 450 AD, they went through a remarkable period. First under the Greeks, as I said, and then later under the Europeans. But from 450 AD onwards, it began to fall apart. First, the Romans lost the Western Roman Empire, including Rome itself. And for a couple of centuries, the Eastern Roman Empire, based out of Constantinople, what we now call Istanbul, sort of staggered along. But certainly by the 750, the Arabs had basically taken over even most of the Eastern Empire. So essentially what happens from around the 450 onwards, the Roman Empire goes into serious decline. Yes, very often the fall of Constantinople happened in 1453, but basically by the time that happened, it was all over. So from 450 to about 1450, we have about 1,000 years of decline in Europe, when Europe became a backwater. In fact, large parts of Europe were basically taken over by others. You had Asiatic tribes, first the Huns, then the Mongols, and so on, who took over much of Eastern Europe. Much of Southeastern Europe was taken over by the Turks, and much of Southwestern Europe was actually taken over by the Arabs. And despite all these attempts to do crusades, etc., most of them were entire failures. And essentially, Europe, for that 1,000 years, was actually worse technologically in terms of art, economic importance, etc., than what it had been during the previous period. And then something remarkable happened in the 1400s. Starting with northern Italy, but then it spread everywhere. You saw this spark of something called the Renaissance. Today you think of the Renaissance in terms of art, but in fact, art was just a small part of it. When you go to Florence and see all those beautiful buildings, or you go to Venice and see all those buildings, do remember, the art was the side effect of a much wider revolution in intellectual risk-taking. Florence's real contribution is not art, it's double-entry bookkeeping. It was a banking hub. Venice's great contribution is the stock market. That is what was generating all that wealth that was coming. And very quickly you see that showing through in art, it shows through in the sciences with people like Galileo. And do remember that many of these characters actually knew each other, and they were contemporaries or near contemporaries. So whether it's Galileo, Michelangelo, Da Vinci, and so on, many of them knew each other or they were rivals. And so it's very, very important to realize that in a relatively small area, a small number of people were breaking the shackles in their mind and taking all kinds of risk. Why am I telling you this? Because the point is, a risk-taking culture doesn't show up in any one space. When you go through a Renaissance, there is no example of a Renaissance happening in a silo. It will simultaneously happen in every sphere of human activity. And so is it that happened to Europe. You saw that revival in northern Italy. It happened in art, it happened in economics, it happened in science. And then you see that spreading. So you see that spreading to Spain and Portugal, where basically the Spanish and the Portuguese first threw out the Arabs and took control of their country. You see that going to the Dutch. And again, as they are reconquering their country back from the Arabs, the Spanish are also funding simultaneously these great voyages of Columbus and Vasco da Gama. And it's not just a matter of getting into a ship and sailing. It required dramatic improvements in maritime design, in cartography, in all kinds of other areas. And of course, it required a risk-taking capability of simply getting into a tiny ship and sailing into the unknown. That was an attitude. Then it spreads in the 1500s to Britain. Within a generation, you see, the same bunch of people are doing Shakespearean plays. Francis Drake sails around the world and sinks the Armada. These are the tiny group of people. Francis Drake was not a good guy. Okay? He was a pirate. But he is the person who sank the Spanish Armada. And by the way, he would have live watched Shakespeare's first productions of his plays. Again, small number of people sitting in a small country up in northern Europe, and they did dramatic things. And with that, you see Europe basically taken over the world. Today, as we watch the decline of Europe, it is important to remember how they came up. It was an extraordinary bunch of, and a very small number of people doing some incredibly risky things. Columbus was not a good guy. Vasco da Gama was not a good chap. And Francis Drake was also not a good person as people. But you have to admire their chutzpah in the crazy things they did. Columbus changed history, not because he was brilliant. He ended up in the Americas. He was in the wrong place. To the last day, when he died, he continued to believe that he had reached the Indies. So, he was not even a good sailor. He was a bad navigator. And even after he had made an amazing discovery, he did not understand the significance of what he had discovered. And yet, he changed the world because of his chutzpah, his risk-taking ability. Same thing happened with Vasco da Gama. I mean, Mumbai, by the way, became a major hub, not because of the British first, but because of the Portuguese. Directly derived from the voyages of Vasco da Gama. Again, Vasco da Gama was no good guy. He hated the Indians. He looked down on Hindus. He would have, by modern standards, be certainly considered an absolute bigot. But you have to admire his guts, nonetheless. So why am I telling you all of this? Because we may be in the beginning of a change in our own way of thinking about risk. Sitting here in the early 20th century, we have to also think of our own history and how we perceive ourselves. All of a sudden, we are suddenly finding in very recent times that we can actually build high quality, global standard infrastructure. Could we have built this earlier? Why is it that Mumbai had to wait for almost 8 decades after the British left to be able to build an alternative to those 2 train lines and those 2 highways? After all, the British were able to build it with 19th and even 18th century technology. So clearly it was not a problem of technology. What was the problem? Why is it that with the one exception of Karnataka's Vidhan Sauda, I cannot think of one decent looking building that India built after independence till we recently began building the Central Vista buildings in Delhi. I cannot think of one single building that we somehow told ourselves that those ugly, brutalist CPWD architecture was somehow acceptable. And that Chandigarh had beautiful buildings. Just take out your phones and look at what those buildings look like. You know, the state secretariat in Chandigarh, just open in your phone and look at what it looks like. It's like astounding ugliness. And yet we sold to ourselves that this was, you know, independent India's answer to the Taj Mahal or the North and South Block or whatever it is that others had built in this country before that. And I'm not just talking about foreign invaders. We ourselves had built the Brihadeshwara temple. We had built, you know, Chittor fort and some amazing architecture. But post-independence, we just didn't seem to have the guts to build it. We would not have built this building here, right next to Ballard Pier. This is, again, one of the first times I'm actually seeing something aesthetically pleasing built in this part of Mumbai after independence. So, what am I getting at? I'm getting at the fact that we are probably at the very beginning of a long cycle. And in this long cycle, we need to see in risk-taking in every arena of human endeavor. Those here, sitting here, obviously trying to do it in the business/technology space. But let me tell you, culturally, you cannot separate it from risk-taking in art, in architecture, in sports, in a myriad other fields. And if we protect this risk-taking culture, then we will begin to suddenly succeed in multiple fronts all of a sudden. So therefore, it is very, very important what you are doing. What you're doing is not just about technology. What you're not doing is just taking risk because you want to prove yourself individually. You are the result of a new breed of risk-taking culture that this country desperately needs. So this is why I'm very excited to be here. But it requires for us to invest into this as well. Whether it's in terms of government policy, for example, it is extraordinary to me that till 8 years ago, we did not even have a proper insolvency and bankruptcy code. How on earth can you have creative destruction without even having insolvency and bankruptcy? When I began to work on cleaning up the banks in 2017-18, I made the case that rather than create a bad bank and put all the garbage there to be kept alive with taxpayers' money forever, why don't we just bankrupt these guys and sell off the assets? And many of the established officials of the system thought I was completely crazy. Oh, what will happen to all the jobs? But what will happen to these people? You know, what will happen to these companies? Because we are simply stuck with trying to keep alive dead wood. Whereas progress is based on risk-taking, and risk-taking means that some part of what exists must get destroyed as a part of that churn. Today, not too many people will blink an eye if a relatively large company just shuts down. When Jet Airways shut down during the height of COVID, everybody said, oh my God, our civil aviation industry will shut down as a result of this. Nothing terribly bad happened. When some very large steel companies went bust during that period, nothing very terrible happened. They were just purchased by somebody else and business carried on. So we need to be willing to allow this churn to happen. Very importantly, the culture of allowing this failure should also be allowed. Indeed, in some ways, we should be willing to celebrate this failure. Because it's only by taking risk only means that some part of it goes bad, right? Otherwise, how is it a risk at all? Before Vasco da Gama made it all the way here, the Portuguese had done, over a period of 60 to 70 years, pushed by somebody called Prince Henry the Navigator, they had done almost 60 to 70 years of expeditions to find their way down to the bottom of Africa before they made the turn. It's actually almost a decade before Vasco da Gama that somebody called Bartholomew Dias had made that voyage. And they had done it one step at a time. And all along that way, they had lost dozens of ships, crews, and many of them had gone badly wrong, wrecked along the way. And yet they persisted. So we need to have that culture of persistence where we should be willing to allow a large part of what goes on in this room. If that does not fail, I don't think you're taking enough risk. So we need to have a culture which encourages this, and that has to be deliberately defended. So let me come to the last part of what I want to say, is that at every step along this way, because churn is naturally destabilizing by its nature, there will always be a slippery slope of wanting to protect what already exists. Let me tell you that that is a bad idea. You are witnessing the decline of Europe. The reason for that is Fortress Europe ultimately destroyed the very thing that led to its growth. Fortress Europe did not lead to great innovations. Fortress Europe did not, and all those bureaucratic rules to protect European companies did not lead Europe to become a great hub of innovation. Instead, Europe's greatest companies today basically make handbags. This is what you will get if you aspire to a protected market. So one of the things that we must, as a country, demand is that we need, now that we have gone through a cycle of creating enough capital here, enough new entrepreneurs, etc., we need to go out there into uncharted, unprotected markets at the frontiers of technology, but also at the frontiers of markets. Many of you should be out there capturing markets in other countries. And we should be pretty blunt about what we are here to do. Mercantilist capitalism rocks. So have absolutely no shame in going out there, building large companies, and making India great again. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. Happy to answer questions if anybody has any. Somebody can give her a mic.
Thank you. It seemed like a lot of history lesson and really appreciate that. But I was wondering in this, I mean, if you look at startup or companies, they're very ambitious. We do want to expand. But do we see that kind of push from government where, you can relax DGFT rules and all of that? Is that happening in parallel?
So it depends what you want from the government. As you may know, many of you know me, know that I'm generally suspicious of the government. So if there are rules that are getting in the way of your innovation, I am always there to change them for you. If you want support from government, then I'm usually suspicious of it. So I am in favor of opening the spaces out for you, which if government is getting in the way. I am, however, while I agree there are certain areas where government support is indeed needed, like for example, we have just yesterday done a major package for providing export guarantees, for example. So yes, there are areas where government is needed, but as a general principle, I am against government support.
But do you see the kind of support Chinese companies have gotten from the government?
As I told you that...
Not financial in terms of rules and
What do you
regulation.
mean by that? That's why I asked you that question. I'm happy to change rules, but I'm not happy to let bureaucrats interfere with markets.
But I think it's not about market, because beyond a point, startups or investors can't do much if the regulations are not in place.
So that's what I'm asking. Do you want either the government to create frameworks that are useful?
Yes.
Then tell us what those frameworks could be.
I'll give you one example. We were trying to sell drones to Saudi Arabia. And for that, you have to register drone in their portal. But our DGFT took it's been still lying with them. It's been 2 months. And there's not much happening from Indian side.
So please give me information on this. I know DGFT is also trying to introduce some other rules which I'm having to have a look at. But it is not acceptable that they are squatting on your application for 2 months. It's not done. No sense of humor about this.
Hi, my name is Harsh. Thank you for such an introductory session on history. You mentioned that entrepreneurship today requires a lot of risk-taking.
Not today, by definition.
By definition, yes, and positivity. So I would say in the past 10 years, we have seen that entrepreneurship and any kind of failure is equated with wrongdoing, subject to 200 agencies and leading to 10, 20 years of court and investigations.
So this is exactly what I'm trying, this is exactly the culture that I'm trying to break. And so I fully appreciate what you're saying. Failure should be accepted. Obviously, if there's a scam, that's a different thing.
Of course.
But I totally appreciate the point you're making that we should not equate failure with some scam. So one of the purposes of giving this talk, but also I do similar talks within the government, is to break this thinking.
And second question...
And one of the reasons I don't like the government being involved in your businesses, Because this is the kind of thinking that bureaucrats will naturally have. Because do remember, by the very fact that they've taken the UPSC exam, it tells you that they have a certain mindset. So you have here an adverse selection in terms of the kinds of people you bring into the system in the first place. So you cannot expect them to think the way you're thinking, because they have already self-selected a particular mindset.
So how do we break that?
By keeping them away from you.
And what is the...
That is why when she said we want government support, I was panicking. Why do you want them? Why on earth do you want these people to have anything to do with you other than fixing the roads, creating some regulatory frameworks when necessary, but by and large keeping away from you?
And the second part, you mentioned that we should be encouraged to go to uncharted territories and undiscovered markets. Now that also brings me to my second question: is that capital control in India is so high, and there's so many regulations that we need to break to even send 1 rupee abroad, or even have equity swap or any kind of like these financial...
No, so as you may have seen, both SEBI and RBI in the last 6 months have made a lot of changes. So we will keep changing these over time.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Hi, sir. Shailendra from Fasal. Great talk. I have 2 questions. In a way, I had grown to believe that the Renaissance which is going on in India is irreversible now. So it is slightly scary to hear that you believe that it is reversible.
Everything is reversible.
So my question is, if you look at it as an arc, where do you think this becomes non-reversible, and what are the markers of a society where you cannot go back?
You have to remember it is always reversible. Because a society is a complex adaptive system. You go into a virtuous cycle, but some political event, some ideological shift can throw you off. And that is why right in the beginning, I gave you the example of Kolkata. 100 years ago, Kolkata was the hub of all this risk-taking, of every kind, okay? It was not just the hub of our freedom struggle, okay? Modern Hinduism is essentially a Bengali creation, okay? Whether it's Sri Aurobindo or Vivekanand and so on. Huge innovations. Similarly, all the top scientists were Bengali. Acharya Jagadish Chandra Bose and Satyen Bose and all these guys. I'm not even going into the freedom struggle with Netaji Subhash Bose and all those people. But it may come as some shock to you to realize that for a community that is not today thought of as businessmen, that in fact 100 years ago, Bengalis were considered to be the most entrepreneurial people in this country. Okay? 1905, when there was the first attempt to partition Bengal, there was the original Swadeshi movement. And it may come as a surprise to you to know that the original Swadeshi movement was nothing to do with charkhas. It was actually a modernist movement. Indians wanted to build modern factories. And many things happened as a result of this. You saw new factories in Gujarat. In fact, the Tatas are a part of this effort as well. But the place where it actually was most successful, interestingly, was Bengal. You had huge number of Bengali entrepreneurs, Sulekha Inks. Forgotten now, but this was a major company at that time. Bengal Chemicals, Calcutta Chemicals, Mohini Mills. Incidentally, Mohini Mills, Mohini Mohan Chakravarti is my great-grandfather. He set up these mills in 1906 as a response to this. He was funded by no less than Rabindranath Tagore. And he set up mills called Mohini Mills in Kushtia, which is now on the other side of the border. And by the time India became independent, he had one of the largest mills in the world in Kushtia. He had 48,000 spindles in one location and 6,000 workers. Okay. Now, of course, as I said, we lost it in partition. But Kolkata was, even as recently as 1970 when I was born, still the single most important industrial hub in India, and outside of Japan, the second most important industrial hub in Asia, as recently as 1970. and then it all fell apart. So the point I'm making to you is, it can fall apart at any time. It has to be held together. Just like, for example, in Europe, it was Italy that led to the Renaissance thing. But Italy was not what created great empires. It was Spain and later on Britain and France that created great empires. Italy actually went back to being a backwater. And it's only in the post-war period that Italy has gone through a renaissance of sorts. So this attitude of risk-taking and is something that has to be protected and actively added to and defended, because at every point in time, there will be people trying to undermine it, because change is uncomfortable. And you're seeing that happening right in front of your face in the West. First, of course, Europe is already in decline, but even in the US, where I would argue even today there is some parts of the US which are still amazingly active and risk-taking, it is still capable of creating people like Elon Musk. But let us be very clear that this culture in the US is itself under some severe threat. Do not be, there is a chance that the US will go the Europe way. It's not certain, nothing is certain, but it is entirely possible that it will become just another Europe a few years from now, because the discomfort of continuous churn and risk-taking will ultimately lead to a generation that says, screw it, it's too difficult, let's kind of just sort of create a fortress of some sort and protect ourselves. Which is basically what Europe has done. And of course, it doesn't protect you. All it does is that it creates a false sense of security, and you fall behind the rest of the world. By the way, after independence, this is what we did to ourselves. After independence, what did we do? We said, okay, now we are free. Did we say, okay, now let's kind of compete with the rest of the world? No. We said, let's shut everything around and let's create a license permit Raj. That's what we did. So just because if you have a mindset which is afraid of risk-taking, afraid of the rest of the world, hiding behind and trying to sort of protect what exists is actually far, far more dangerous as for us as a country, a civilization, etc., than it is to actually compete in the rest of the world, fail a few times, but be in the game.
Sir, when it comes to risk-taking, sir.
Yeah, okay.
So when it comes to risk-taking for Viksit Bharat 2047 Sankalp, deep tech and deep tech R&D must be focused on. But it is highly capital intensive when it comes to deep tech R&D. So when it comes to bringing private investment into it, how investors could be convinced on this part owing to the high risk of investment?
Now, obviously, some amount of state support is needed for deep tech type things. But let me say that Indian private sector R&D really lets the side down. Indian companies are no longer small companies. Okay? We are very proud of our generics pharmaceuticals companies. They are not small companies anymore. They may have been when they started out in the 90s, but sitting here in 2025, I'm sorry, most of these companies are world-size companies. And with a few exceptions, how many new molecules do you know of that Indian industry has come up with? Hardly any. And I can go on and on. Just look at the R&D budgets of our large companies or even of our medium-sized companies. Why? When I ask people, say, oh, it's risky. Of course it's risky. That's the whole point. So when I go and talk in events by CII and FICCI and all of this kind of thing, I very often make this point. And after a little while, titans of industry try to change the topic to some CSR activity they're doing. And while I have the greatest of sympathy for weavers in Jharkhand, it is not a substitute for R&D labs. And I'm sure your art collection is wonderful, but I would much rather see your labs. So this is something that we really need to see Indian private industry getting out there and investing in labs. That interestingly, till the 1950s, Indian industry used to actually put in more effort into this. The Tatas themselves are, by the way, the source of a lot of our big IISc, TIFR, and all those kinds of things. But somewhere along the way, even they kind of lost the way. वही बिट्स पिलानी बिरला ने बनाया था 19 whatever 40s में whenever. Where are today's bits pilanis? There are new campuses of that old institution. By and large, they are teaching institutions. They are not research institutions. So that culture did go away. And yet we were able to do this before independence. No Indian resident in India since independence has won a Nobel Prize in any area of human endeavor, except in some povertarian type thing. Leave the peace awards around. Those are not, they may be good for the individuals who won it, but they are not a reflection of us as a society, as a successful society. But not in any of the sciences. Indeed, not even in economics has any resident Indian won a Nobel. And yet, we were capable of winning them before independence. In fact, they used to come from Kolkata, which I mentioned earlier. Both C.V. Raman and Rabindranath Tagore won, despite racism, despite being a colonial country, we were able to win Nobel Prizes before independence. After independence, no resident Indian has been able to replicate this. Indeed, the two peace prizes also we have been given to Indian residents are not a reflection of us as a successful society. What does that tell you? That we have really not pushed ourselves as a society after independence to go for a pursuit of excellence. And it's only in relatively recent times that we have begun to think like this. Far from pursuing excellence, there was actually active effort by society, and I will name by the elite of our society, to actually stymie pursuit of excellence. So, it is our elites and various kinds of civil society groups funded by elites which delayed projects like, for example, your metro, for no reason at all. Same thing happened with the upgrade of the Central Vista project in Delhi. You actually had a situation that leading members of Delhi's elite were making a case that Shastri Bhavan was somehow something worth preserving. You've got to be kidding me. And now that we are moving into these new buildings, the gap in the facilities is just shocking. We are now, as some of you may be aware, we are now emptying out North Block and South Block. We are in the process of doing that. And they are now going to be converted into our National Museum. So, combining North Block and South Block, the museum, it will be the world's largest national museum. Finally, we are showing some ambition. Those buildings are beautiful buildings, but they are useless as, effectively useless as offices. Believe me, I used to work in one of them. They're not great as offices. I mean, a small number of very senior officers had nice, large window offices, but for the average person working there, it was terrible. It was even I'm not even going to Shastri Bhavan, even North Block was full of rats, cats, monkeys, all kinds of ridiculous things that the experience of actually functioning there was, simply not up to speed for a 21st century economy. We are now emptying it out. We will rebuild, we'll have to redo it quite a lot. But meanwhile, all these ministries are moving into modern buildings. And I cannot believe that there was such a loud opposition to it. Bizarrely done in the name of, by the way, protecting jamun trees. Just like in RA colony, some 100 trees were being protected. So you have to remember that churn is always threatening to the incumbent establishment. So sooner or later they will try and stall it. We should not allow that to happen. This happened in Europe, and as I said, socialism didn't come to America from some boondocks in the Rust Belt. It came there, right in front of our eyes, in Manhattan. So the elites, after a little while, begin to stink. And as I keep saying, elites are like underwear. It's all good to have them, but if you don't change them often enough, they begin to stink.
Sir, I have a question around your risk-taking culture within the government. Since you are a part of the government and policy making, we take the criticism on entrepreneurs, risk-taking, especially in terms of R&D, where we are lagging behind. But sir, where is the risk-taking culture in the policy realm today? We don't see any boldness in economic decision-making today within the government. All factors of production reforms are still pending.
So let me counter that. We have done in the last decade incredible number of changes. So let me tell you some of them. You will all know that. Just a decade ago, we didn't actually have an insolvency and bankruptcy code. Remember that? We did not have a GST system. We didn't even have a unified market. So in 2017, when we introduced GST, we actually signed a free trade agreement with ourselves. And when we did it, by the way, as you will know, any country that introduces GST takes a huge political risk. In fact, India is the only country in the world where the government was re-elected after introducing GST. Then not only did we introduce it, make it work for a while, just a few months ago, we have further fixed it and simplified it and so on. At each step, a huge amount of effort goes into it. Okay? Then, we did something, and by the way, all of them are deflationary and painful things to do. We introduced inflation targeting. People have forgotten that India used to be a 8 to 12% inflation country. Yeah? That was what typically, we were not an Argentina type high inflation country, but we were always a 8 to 12% inflation country. We have now anchored inflation in the 2 to 6% range. That is a 600 basis point reduction in structural inflation. In fact, right now inflation is basically zero. To do this, it meant that for a longish period of time, real interest rates had to be ridiculously high. You had to squeeze the banking system, and to do it while you were also cleaning up the banks using insolvency and bankruptcy. All of these are not popular things to do. And as somebody who had to implement it, let me tell you, I have no intention of ever having to clean up the banking system or NBFCs ever again, because it's like extracting your own teeth. But these are painful things. Then managing this economy through COVID and retaining discipline while doing it when everybody around you wants you to go there, blow up the fiscal, blow up the monetary, and on a daily basis, every expert on the planet, particularly NRI experts in America, are telling you that, you should do more and that you are evil for not spending even more money and blowing up budgets to help the poor and so on. Maintaining discipline through that period. And then subsequently going sector by sector and opening them up and cleaning them up. There is a lady here who, from the drone sector, let me tell you the battles I had to fight to reduce in 2020, to reduce the kind of thing, regulations they had. I and a person called Manhar Yadav sat over several weekends and reduced it from 77 to 7. And neither of us knew how to fly, even fly a drone. We just did it with common sense. And that each one of these is risk-taking. Because after all, after having done those reductions, it's quite possible that the next fine day, some terrorist strike somewhere would happen and I would be blamed for it. You know, the bank, after all, we came out of the COVID crisis decently well and people now recognize it. But let me tell you, while we are going through the COVID crisis and you are holding your conviction, do remember that everybody around you is telling you that you're wrong and that you're a bad person for maintaining discipline. So that is risk-taking. Even this recent changes we have done, for example, in shipbuilding, okay? The amount of effort it required over the last 2 years to first identify that India should be a shipbuilding country. So if you go back just 2 years ago, I stood up in a conference and basically said something to the effect that shipbuilding is a sector in which India can be one of the big guys. Everybody thought I was crazy because 55% or 60% of all the ships in the world are built in China. Another 20% is built in Korea, and another 22, 23% in Japan. Between them, they build basically 95% of the world's ships. We, till recently, were building only 0.3% of the world's commercial ships. Okay? Little bit more in naval ships, but basically that. So, to make a case that this is a sector where we can put resources and become globally competitive required quite a lot of things. And what did we have to do? I had to then work hard and change all our maritime-related rules for flagging, for ownership, registration. Each one of them required digging in, finding some colonial era 19th century rule that had to be changed. And at every stage, there are interest groups who are incumbents, who are not happy about the fact that you're changing this. Then a 70,000 crore fund had to be created to encourage shipbuilding. Of course, we had to give infrastructure status to ships. And you have to push back against ridiculous arguments. For example, when we pushed for giving infra status to ships, one of the arguments pushback arguments from somebody I will not name, but a very senior bureaucrat is, how can you give infra status to ships? Because infrastructure is a fixed asset and ships are not fixed. So I had to explain to them that this is term fixed asset is not about it being fixed, it's actually a accounting term and it's fixed in an accounting sense, but I was clearly not making any progress with this argument. So finally, this is the argument that won the day. I said, do you agree that railways and trains are infrastructure? Notice that they also move. So therefore, ships also move and they can be infrastructure. So based on that argument, it was finally announced by Nirmala ji in the budget earlier this year as infrastructure status. It now has infrastructure status. So therefore, ships and shipbuilding can finally be given 30-year loans. I'm just telling you at every stage, the effort that goes in, the pushback from incumbents, not just in the bureaucracy, but from industry. And every time you make changes, industry will say, yes, yes, we want changes, we want, but I'll tell you, 90% of presentations that I see from industry is not asking for any reforms. They're mostly asking for protection. And now I see so many of these that I can tell you by looking at the color combination, which consultant has made them. And by and large, the presentations go as follows. So in case at some day you guys come to make presentations, I'm just telling you how it looks to us. Here is what the average presentation of an industry group looks like. The first two slides are India has 1.45 billion people. Therefore, we have 2.8 billion feet. They all need shoes. Some assumption on how many shoelaces they continue to need. Then there is a slide which will basically say, therefore, the shoelace industry is the single most important industry in the country. The next slide will be some slide of some poor people in a village making shoelaces. It employs 50 million people. It's the single most important industry in the country is the shoelace industry. Then after some more gobbledygook, they will say we need a 0.25% interest subvention and some sort of a quality control order. This is, by and large, 90% of presentations that I see follow this. So, when I say that we need a culture of risk-taking, that culture has to not just seep the government, it has to seep through to society as a whole. It has to seep through to parents who are pushing talented kids to sit for UPC exams with a 99.99% failure rate. And I keep telling them that there are higher chance of becoming billionaires than of joining the civil service. Or to business and private sector, which has to invest into risk-taking, R&D, and so on. It has to seep through to government, which has to understand that risk-taking means some amount of failure and that they shouldn't see failure as some sort of a moral failing. And I'm making a small effort as a result of to try and change this, because I think this has to be taught to kids as they grow up. So as I happen to be, and I'm going to end with this story, I happen to be actually rewriting the NCERT textbooks, the social studies part. And when I began doing it, the most interesting thing I found is that the textbooks that I was changing are not old textbooks. They were only written in 2011, the textbooks that were being taught till recently. And all of them had some very dukh bhari katha and povertarian narrative in them. So if they showed something on agriculture, it had to be 2 half-starved cows and 1 guy also looking half-starved. And if they were showing a village school with black and white photograph of some school in a tent. Now those kinds of things don't exist even in the villages even today. You'll never, so I began to look into where they found those pictures, and I discovered that the picture of the school is actually a picture of a 1948 refugee camp in Delhi. And similarly, if there was a photograph of some industry, then it'll usually be some potter or something like that. No modern industries of any kind. In fact, there was no sign of any modern technology in the textbooks. They'd almost been edited out. And as I said, these are textbooks that came on stream in 2011, so not some long time ago. So I am currently changing these textbooks, bringing in modern technology, modernity into it. Doesn't mean that we don't reflect reality. Yes, there are poor people, traditional industries exist, and that is also reflected. But we reflect drones, we reflect satellite photographs, we reflect labs, and we are introducing in there chapters on things like entrepreneurship. It has the heroes that are given there, that are talked about as sort of people to look up to. I've introduced entrepreneurs, innovators. Earlier, they used to only be NGO walas. So as a result of which, you have to begin to change that. But it's not just the textbooks. Another thing that I'm doing, which will find you of interest, is that I want to demonstrate to people that we are very proud of this ancient civilization, but we were not great because we were sitting in India, contemplating the world and waiting for others to conquer us. We were a great civilization because we were a risk-taking civilization, just like Europe rose because of its Columbuses and Francis Drakes and Da Gamas. India too, during its great period, had great explorers. And India has unfortunately completely forgotten its maritime history. So about a decade ago, I wrote a book called The Ocean of Churn, which was about rediscovering our own maritime explorations in the Indian Ocean and beyond. After all, the largest Hindu temple in the world is not in India, it's in Cambodia. Why is it there? Why is there a country called Indonesia? or Singapore. Because we did these great voyages of exploration in ancient times. So to relive this, in the last couple of years, I've actually built a ship from the Gupta period. It's a full-fledged ship, 21 meters long. I have used only technologies existing in 1600 years ago. It's stitched together, no nails. And as we speak, it is now in the Indian Navy. It's called INSV Kondinya. We are now learning how to sail it because, as I said, it doesn't have any modern technology on it. So there's nobody alive knows how to sail these ships, and I'm learning how to do it. But the idea is that at the end of this year, we will try and attempt to sail it to Oman. So the ship will have 15 sailors from the Navy and one random economist. And hopefully we will do... So evidently somebody doesn't approve of the voyage. And with that, let me stop. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen.
Thank you very much, Sanjeev. You have given us enough food for thought, food for laughs, food for introspection, and the real food is back there for a short break.